June 9th, 1944. The suffocating air inside the commander's barracks at Saint-Germain shimmered with heat and cigarette smoke as teleprinters clattered without rhythm, spitting out fragments of reports that no longer formed a coherent picture. Outside, the rumble of trucks and the distant growl of Allied bombers never completely faded, as if the sky itself had joined the invasion. At a long wooden table covered with maps of Normandy, Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt stood motionless, one hand resting on the edge, his tired eyes fixed on the red arrows creeping inland from the beaches. The room was crowded with officers talking over one another, but their voices blended into a dull, anxious hum. Rundstedt heard none of it. He was listening instead to the quiet arithmetic of disaster forming in his mind, a rhythm he had learned across decades of war and which never lied. He had seen the initial situation reports the moment they arrived: bridges collapsed under Luftwaffe retreat, armored reserves trapped behind destroyed rail lines, infantry divisions scattered by naval gunfire before they had even reached assembly points. Yet what struck him most was not the chaos itself, but the scale of what was coming. Within 48 hours, the Allies had landed more men than the entire defensive reserve of Army Group B. Within 72, their supply flow already exceeded what the Germans could deliver to the front in a week. The difference was not tactical, not even operational. It was mathematical, industrial, inevitable. Rundstedt understood this before anyone else because he had lived long enough to see wars decided by numbers as much as by generals. He remained outwardly calm, the posture of an old aristocrat shaped by Prussian discipline, but a heavy stillness settled behind his eyes. Reports kept arriving, panzer divisions delayed by fuel shortages, artillery units paralyzed by broken communications, coastal strongpoints overrun not by brilliance, but by sheer weight of men and materiel. Each fragment confirmed what his instinct had already whispered even before the first Allied landing craft touched the shore, that Germany no longer possessed the means to shape the battlefield. The Allies were not merely breaking through, they were replacing the entire logic of the war with one Germany could not survive. Behind him, younger officers argued about counterattacks, about pushing the Allies back into the sea, about decisive blows. Rundstedt did not raise his voice. He simply inhaled slowly, feeling the weight of truth pressing against his ribs. The High Command had convinced itself that spirit could compensate for steel, that resolve could replace fuel, that faith in victory could substitute for the thousands of tanks and aircraft Germany could no longer build. But as he studied the expanding front, he saw only one outcome: a long, unstoppable collapse spreading outward from Normandy like a slow, suffocating storm. A messenger approached with another report: Montgomery's line expanding, American armor pushing towards Carentan, naval guns preventing any organized German maneuver. Rundstedt accepted the paper without expression, folded it once, and placed it on the table. At that moment he understood with crushing clarity that the war had slipped beyond rescue, and that he was now the custodian of a truth no one else in that room was willing to speak aloud. And yet he knew he would soon have to, because the illusions around him were tightening and the silence was becoming dangerous. And in the days to come, that silence would force him towards a confrontation that even he could not yet imagine. Long before the storms of 1944 gathered over France, Gerd von Rundstedt had been shaped by a world that was already disappearing. Born into an old Prussian military family, he learned discipline not as a virtue, but as the air one breathed. Obedience not as submission, but as the architecture of order. As a young cadet, he marched across parade grounds where the ghosts of Frederick the Great seemed to whisper that a soldier's worth lay in clarity of command and the steadiness of his own silence. Those early years forged a man who believed that warfare was a profession, not a crusade, and that victory depended on structure rather than passion. The Great War reinforced these beliefs. His regiments moved with mechanical precision, and he watched entire fronts hinge on logistics and timing rather than romantic notions of heroism. Through the turbulent years of the Weimar Republic and the rise of the new regime, Gerd von Rundstedt clung to that older worldview. He saw himself as a servant of the state, not its ideology. He had no interest in party politics, nor in the fiery speeches that captivated younger officers. What mattered to him were divisions, supply columns, railway timetables, and the quiet, relentless arithmetic of manpower. His loyalty was to Germany, not to the theories of those who now claimed to guide her destiny. Yet that same loyalty also blinded him. He accepted orders from men whose ambitions far exceeded their understanding. He watched as the army he loved was reshaped by political pressure rather than strategic logic. But he remained at his post, convinced that stability would return if only the officer corps endured long enough. War rewarded his steadiness. In Poland, in France, and during the early phases of the Eastern Campaign, he demonstrated a mastery of operational maneuver rooted in that old Prussian doctrine: swift concentration, controlled withdrawal, preservation of strength over reckless glory. Younger officers spoke of him with a mixture of awe and frustration. He was not brilliant in the way of improvisational commanders, but he possessed an instinctive grasp of the battlefield's pulse. To him, a successful operation was not a heroic charge, but a perfectly timed sequence, a machine whose parts moved with disciplined inevitability. And yet beneath that composed exterior he carried an unspoken burden. Each victory sharpened his awareness of Germany's structural weaknesses. Each triumph hinted at the fragility beneath the surface. By 1944, this internal tension had reached its breaking point. Rundstedt had lived through enough campaigns to recognize when an army was stretched beyond its capacity. When he studied the map of Normandy, he did so through the lens of decades of experience. The supply shortages he had witnessed in Russia, the understrength battalions he had tried to reinforce in France, the logistical degradation he had warned about long before anyone else dared speak of it. His entire life had trained him to read these signs with clinical precision. He could not deceive himself with political slogans or ideological confidence. The traditions that had shaped him, discipline, realism, duty, compelled him to see the truth clearly, even when that truth threatened the foundations of everything he served. But those same traditions also held him back. The belief that a soldier obeys, that he endures, that he does not dictate policy. These convictions had carried him through decades of service. Now they bound him in a tightening paradox. He could interpret the battlefield better than anyone else, yet he was trapped inside a command structure that no longer listened to its own professionals. The army he knew had been replaced by one ruled as much by fear as by strategy. And as Rundstedt prepared to deliver his first warnings about the irreversible situation in Normandy, he sensed that his devotion to duty was about to collide with a political world that valued loyalty over truth. And soon, his understanding of the collapsing front would force him to confront not just the war's reality, but the disintegrating system built above it. By late June 1944, the flow of reports reaching the headquarters at Saint-Germain had turned into a grim, uninterrupted torrent. Rundstedt read them methodically, the way a doctor reads vital signs of a patient whose decline has already surpassed hope. Infantry battalions were arriving at the front under strength, some reduced to half their numbers before their first engagement. Panzer divisions that were supposed to counterattack with decisive force were immobilized for lack of fuel or scattered along roads cratered by Allied bombers who patrolled the skies with effortless dominance. Each document, each telegram, each frantic call from a corps commander painted the same picture. The front was collapsing not because of one mistake, but because the structure that supported it had rotted through. And as Rundstedt studied these fragments, he felt the familiar tightening in his chest, the unmistakable sensation that truth was taking shape, heavy and immovable. Silently, he observed how the Allies advanced with a tempo Germany could no longer match. Their armored columns pushed inland not as isolated spearheads, but as moving fortresses, supported by endless streams of trucks, engineers, fuel convoys, and mobile artillery. Every kilometer they gained widened a gap that German reserves were too weak, too delayed, or too exhausted to fill. Rundstedt had fought the British and Americans before, and he had always respected their logistical efficiency. Now that efficiency had grown into something overwhelming, a machine whose breath could be felt across the entire theater. Even if German units fought bravely, and many did, they were simply being consumed by a scale of war the Reich could no longer sustain. At headquarters, conversations grew more frantic. Staff officers argued about miracle weapons, about redeploying phantom reserves, about air support that no longer existed. Rundstedt listened without interruption, offering his assessments with the same calm tone that had guided him through previous campaigns. But whenever he finished speaking, the room went quiet, as if his words carried something dangerous. He made no accusations. He blamed no one. He merely explained that divisions delayed by Allied air power could not counterattack in time, that reserves committed piecemeal would be destroyed piecemeal, that the enemy's industrial advantage had finally reached its full crushing potential. His logic was simple and unbearable for those who still believed that resolve could replace resources. Meanwhile, the reality outside those walls deteriorated with every passing hour. Rundstedt watched maps being updated by trembling hands. Arrows representing Allied advances grew thicker, spreading like veins across Normandy. German positions that had once seemed stable collapsed under the weight of concentrated firepower. In one sector, an entire regiment disappeared after being caught in open fields by fighter bombers. In another, armored battalions were ordered forward only to arrive shattered, their tanks smoking ruins along the hedgerows. Rundstedt knew these losses were irreversible. What they reflected was not temporary misfortune, but systemic exhaustion. The war in the West, as he understood with growing certainty, had already been lost in the first 72 hours. Yet the most painful burden came not from the battlefield, but from the silence that followed his assessments. Younger officers looked away, unwilling to meet his gaze. Senior commanders shifted uncomfortably, torn between private doubt and public loyalty. Rundstedt sensed his lucidity isolated him. Truth in that room had become a weight others refused to lift. And in that isolation, the field marshal felt an old, familiar loneliness, the loneliness of a man who sees the collapse of a structure he once trusted to endure. Still, he continued to speak, because duty required it. If the front was saved at all, it could be saved only by acknowledging the scale of the disaster. But as he prepared to deliver his most direct warning yet, he realized with a quiet chill that the high command surrounding him was drifting deeper into denial. And soon his insistence on facing reality would bring him into direct collision with the only authority still capable of making decisions, an authority that no longer tolerated unwelcome truths. The journey to the Wolfschanze felt heavier than any Rundstedt had made before. As the armored train carried him through forests soaked by June rain, he studied the memoranda on his lap, summaries of divisions mauled beyond recognition, units withdrawing in fragments, commanders reporting that their men were fighting without air cover, without reserves, without the faintest prospect of relief. He knew these papers by heart already. He had memorized the shape of the catastrophe. Yet he brought them anyway, not as evidence for debate, but as a shield against the unreality he was about to face. In East Prussia, truth did not travel freely. It had to be carried like contraband. When he entered the briefing room, the tension clung to the air with the density of smoke. Generals assembled along the walls, some stiff with nervousness, others performing confidence like actors on a collapsing stage. At the far end of the table sat Hitler, pale, restless, eyes that darted like sparks in a draft. Maps were spread before him, but Rundstedt noticed how the Führer's gaze slipped past the details, settling instead on symbols, arrows, unit names, imagined possibilities.
It was the gaze of a man who had stopped seeing war as a physical reality and had retreated into a realm where will could reshape geography. The meeting began with the usual ritual, officers describing temporary setbacks, local crises, and counterattack opportunities. Rundstedt listened, his jaw tightening with each euphemism. Panzer was not regrouping, it had been devastated by bombing. The 352nd Infantry Division was not holding in depth, it was dissolving in the hedgerows. Yet each statement floated upward like an offering of optimism, carefully sculpted to avoid provoking the wrath seated at the head of the table. When his turn came, Rundstedt stepped forward with the same calm dignity that had defined his entire career. He unfolded the map of Normandy, smoothing it with deliberate care. His voice was controlled, steady, carrying no trace of emotion as he laid out the operational truths. The collapse of reserves, the paralysis of rail transport under Allied air supremacy, the impossibility of massing armor in daylight, the overwhelming ratio of enemy men and materiel. He concluded with the stark assessment that the front could not be restored, that the only chance to preserve any fighting capability was a strategic withdrawal behind the Seine. For a moment, silence. A silence so complete that Rundstedt could hear the ticking of a wall clock somewhere behind him. Then came the eruption. Hitler leaned forward, his hands trembling against the table's edge, his voice rising from disbelief into fury. Withdrawal was defeatism. Withdrawal was treason. The Allies must be driven into the sea. The panzer divisions must strike, must, because he willed it so. Rundstedt met the outburst without flinching. He had endured tempests of command before, but this was different. This was a storm fueled by a worldview that no longer intersected with reality. Around the room, officers stared at the floor, at their papers, anywhere but at the confrontation unfolding before them. Rundstedt attempted once more, choosing his words with care, speaking as a professional soldier to a political master who now treated professional judgment as sabotage. But Hitler cut him off, shouting that Germany needed faith, not calculations. Rundstedt stood motionless, recognizing in that instant the absolute fracture between strategic necessity and the fantasies driving the Reich. And then, with the quiet force of a man who had reached the limits of restraint, he finally spoke the words that none of his peers had dared to utter. "Make peace, you fools." The sentence dropped into the room like a shell burst, its echo stretching across the stunned silence. And before the shock could fade, Rundstedt understood that those 5 words had sealed his fate, and that the machinery of dismissal was already turning against him.
The order relieving Rundstedt of command arrived with the cold impersonality of a bureaucratic form, delivered by an adjutant who avoided meeting his eyes. It stated, in clipped administrative phrasing, that the field marshal was being replaced due to ill health and exhaustion, phrases chosen to soften the humiliation yet sharpen the lie. Rundstedt read the document without expression, folded it once, and placed it on his desk. He knew the truth behind the polite fiction. No system built on illusions could tolerate a man who insisted on describing reality. Outside, trucks rumbled through the courtyard as officers hurried past, careful not to linger. The machinery of war continued to turn with mechanical indifference, as if the departure of its most experienced commander were just another logistical adjustment. His dismissal passed quietly, noted in reports with a sentence or two, overshadowed by the relentless crisis unfolding across France. Yet for Rundstedt, leaving headquarters felt like stepping out of a world he no longer recognized. As he traveled away from the front, he watched through the train window as columns of weary soldiers moved in the opposite direction, battalions reduced to companies, companies to scattered platoons, tanks hauled by tractors, their engines destroyed by Allied aircraft, medical convoys overloaded with wounded who had expected relief that never came. Every scene confirmed his warnings, now beyond the reach of debate. The collapse he had predicted was no longer theoretical. It was happening kilometer by kilometer. In early July, the German defenses in Normandy buckled. American forces broke through at Saint-Lô, pouring into the countryside in a tide of armor that the battered German lines could not stop. British and Canadian troops pressed from the north, widening the front until it resembled not a line, but a series of disconnected islands struggling to stay afloat. Counterattacks ordered from distant headquarters failed before they even reached assembly areas, their strength shattered by the air above them. Rundstedt followed these developments from afar, reading reports with the quiet resignation of a man observing a tragedy scripted long before the actors realized it. He heard the news of other commanders meeting their own fates, some relieved, some disgraced, some choosing to end their lives rather than continue serving a system that demanded obedience but punished honesty. The army he had grown up in, bound by tradition and governed by reason, had been swallowed by a political world where rational advice was treated as betrayal. Rundstedt's departure was not an isolated incident. It was part of a larger unraveling, a sign that the final stage of the war would be fought by men who no longer possessed the authority or clarity to influence events. Yet what struck him most was how precisely events in France unfolded according to his predictions. Armored divisions committed too late vanished in pockets of burning metal. Infantry units forced to hold impossible positions dissolved under the weight of Allied firepower. Entire corps were encircled or simply disappeared as the enemy advanced with relentless momentum. The Seine, which he had designated as the only defensible line, was reached by the Allies in a fraction of the time the High Command had imagined. By August, the German retreat had become a rout, and the ruins of Normandy stood as a monument to the consequences of ignoring truth. From his quiet post-retirement quarters, Rundstedt observed all this with a heaviness that was not bitterness, but something deeper, a sorrow born of understanding. He had spoken plainly, but plain words had no place in a system where denial had become doctrine. The catastrophe that Germany now endured was not solely the result of enemy strength, but of leadership that punished foresight. And as he set down another report filled with stories of encircled divisions and shattered armies, he felt the inevitability of the next chapter approaching, the one where desperation would once again pull him back into a collapsing war he could no longer influence. For even as he watched the disaster unfold, the High Command was preparing to summon him once more, not out of confidence, but out of the emptiness left by shattered illusions and failing men. Autumn 1944 settled over the Reich like a long, exhausted exhale, carrying with it the smell of burning cities, collapsing fronts, and a leadership that no longer pretended to grasp the reality unfolding beneath its feet. It was during this bleak season that Rundstedt, now an aging figure retreating into the quiet of enforced irrelevance, received yet another summons. The High Command, drained of experienced officers and desperate for a symbol of continuity, recalled him to duty. Not because they believed he could restore the collapsing Western Front, but because there was no one left who carried both authority and the illusion of stability. Rundstedt accepted the call without triumph or resentment. Duty, as he understood it, was not tied to success. It was a path one walked until the ground itself disappeared. He returned to a war transformed into something unrecognizable, an archipelago of defensive pockets, a scrambled mosaic of delayed orders, improvised countermeasures, and formations reduced to skeletal remnants. The Western Allies advanced like an incoming tide, steady and unhurried, knowing that the German army could no longer marshal the strength to resist. Rundstedt's new role was not that of a strategist shaping events, but of a caretaker presiding over irreversible decline. He issued commands, repositioned units, authorized withdrawals, but each decision felt like adjusting pieces on a chessboard after checkmate had already been declared.
He no longer fought for victory, but for the preservation of lives, of remnants, of fragments of a once formidable force. In conferences, Rundstedt sensed the same dissonance that had consumed the regime since Normandy, the growing gap between reports drafted to appease political expectations and the brutal facts carried by frontline officers. Hitler, now increasingly isolated, demanded counterattacks and decisive blows from divisions that existed only on paper. Rundstedt listened with professional patience, answering in measured tones, though internally he recognized the tragic absurdity. He was being asked to command the shadow of an army while speaking to the shadow of a leader. The burden of truth, once punished with dismissal, had transformed into a quiet resignation. He no longer argued, he stated realities, with a calm that bordered on sorrow. As the months dragged into winter, his role became even clearer. He was not expected to change the tide, only to delay its arrival. He watched as the Ardennes offensive, launched against his advice, consumed the last reserves Germany possessed. He oversaw withdrawals across the Rhine, the disintegration of formations under American pressure, the steady erosion of what remained of the Wehrmacht structure. And through it all, he carried the weight of a knowledge he had held longer than any other senior commander, that this ending had been set in motion the moment the Allies landed in Normandy and the High Command chose illusions over logic. In the final months of the war, Rundstedt appeared increasingly like a relic from another era, a man shaped by traditions that no longer had a place in the world around him. Soldiers who encountered him remembered not fire or charisma, but a quiet dignity, the weary posture of someone who continued to perform his duties even as the meaning of those duties evaporated. He read reports at a wooden desk in dim-lit rooms while artillery shook the earth outside. He signed orders knowing they would be overtaken by events before the ink dried. He watched the last chapters unfold with the solemnity of a historian observing his own era collapse. When Germany finally fell, Rundstedt did not flee, nor attempt to justify himself. He surrendered with the same discipline that had defined his service, understanding that legacy was not shaped by victory alone, but by the manner in which one navigated defeat. And in the years that followed, historians would judge him with a mixture of criticism and respect, faulting his inability to detach from old loyalties, yet acknowledging the clarity with which he saw the war's trajectory long before the machinery of command allowed anyone to speak it. For ultimately, his place in history rested not on the campaigns he led, but on the moment he spoke a truth unwelcome to those in power. His warning had been ignored, his dismissal justified by polite fictions, yet the accuracy of his judgment echoed through every subsequent collapse on the Western Front. Rundstedt became the embodiment of a lesson the Reich never learned, that systems fall not because truth is absent, but because truth becomes forbidden. And as the last pieces of the war drifted into memory, one image remained. An old field marshal standing over a map in June 1944, seeing the future with painful clarity, while those around him clung to fantasy. For in the end, his legacy was built not on victory, but on the heavy, unyielding weight of being right too soon.